What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today we have got our Week 13 fantasy wide receiver starts and sits for every single matchup. So make sure to tune in. And if you guys enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe. And in the meantime, give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to continue interacting with us there as the week progresses. Shoot us your questions. We'll make sure to answer them. And also check us out online at alldaypigskin.com. Sign up for our free newsletter to get access to exclusive content. All those details in the description. But for now, let's get right into it. Before getting into our breakdowns, I want to give you guys a quick word from our sponsors at Overlay Fantasy Sports, who are taking DFS to a whole nother level. And I specifically want to highlight their matchup shop function, which is an absolute blast. In fact, we've been using it since the start of the NFL season because, let's face it, betting on the same old Team A versus Team B can get a little bit stale, a little bit boring. Well, that's not even close to being the case with the matchup shop of Overlay Fantasy, as it allows you to bet on individual player matchups, and it's super simple. Just pick whichever player you think will have the higher fantasy performance. And just like a regular bet would work, check out the spreads, do your research, and then win some money. You can bet on pretty much any single sport that you want, whether it's NFL, golf, MLB, etc. All those options are there. And again, super simple. Pretty much for any single NFL game coming up, you've got a bunch of different matchups that are always updated and added to. So if it's something as simple as just putting a single submission, you can do that. But guess what? If you want to get a parlay going and double up some of those winnings, you can do that as well. So take advantage of this. All of that homework you're doing for your fantasy lineups, let's have that translate to some big time winnings for your wallet as well. So do yourself a favor and check out Overlay Fantasy's matchup shop now. Kicking things off, we've got the Cincinnati Bengals at the Miami Dolphins. And when it comes to wide receivers to start here, let's begin with the Cincinnati side of things. And unfortunately, it's the much less preferred option because last week, firsthand, we saw what this offense looks like without Joe Burrow under center. And the consensus is that, honestly, it's god awful. But that was really what we all expected and knew would be the outcome. However, there's big names here: Higgins, Boyd, AJ Green. So if you really want to start one of these guys or need to start one of these guys, this is our advice on the situation. Higgins and Boyd are pretty much the only two viable options based on their involvement in this offense up until now. So who has the higher upside? When it comes to upside here, the name of the game will be touchdowns, because without touchdowns, all of these guys, probably best case scenario, 4 receptions, 5 receptions for 40 to 50 yards, and that isn't a startable wide receiver. So when it comes to factoring that touchdown upside in, then maybe you get into that, high-end wide receiver 3 category, low-end wide receiver 2. And right now, Higgins has the highest touchdown upside because of his size, because of his usage in the red zone. So if there's anyone you take a chance on, it would be Higgins. But again, unless you really have to, we would not be starting any one of these guys for the Bengals. That's why Boyd and Greed are sits. And then for the Dolphins, there's only really one name you need to know: Devontae Parker. For the sake of Parker in the Miami offense, it would be better if Ryan Fitzpatrick continues to be the quarterback for them. But regardless, whether it's Fitzpatrick or Tua, Parker is still the much better option in this matchup and really the only option for the Dolphins. That's why he's pretty much the only Miami wide receiver listed here on the week versus this awful Bengals defense. He is a high-end wide receiver 2 with low-end wide receiver 1 upside depending on the Miami quarterback. Then we've got the Raiders at the Jets. For the Raiders, coming off an absolute awful performance, but as we say every single week, the perfect remedy for that is facing the New York Jets. I would take a chance on Nelson Aguilar here. He has the highest ceiling, so that's what you're looking for. Then for the Jets, Brashad Perriman and Jamison Crowder. Yes, I realize that Denzel Mims kind of overshadowed Jamison Crowder this last week, but I'm still banking on the more veteran and proven wide receiver. These guys are both PPR plays. Pretty much whoever you play for the Jets, it's more so a volume pick. Now, overall, this game in terms of wide receivers, you don't really love any of them. I would argue that it would be the running backs here that have a big day. As far as the wide receivers, though, Aguilar for the Raiders, then Perriman and Crowder for the Jets. So for that reason, the odd guys out for the Raiders, Renfro, Henry Ruggs, a little bit too boom or bust. And then for the Jets, Denzel Mims. If he does have another big week where he overshadows Jamison Crowder, we can get in the conversation of having him elevated above Crowder's that wide receiver 2 on the offense. Afterwards, Colts at the Texans. For the Colts, Michael Pittman Jr., he continues to get the most targets, and I will go with that volume. Yes, T.Y. Hilton finally had that big game, quote unquote big game, compared to what he's done so far this season. But in terms of targets, he's still trailing Michael Pittman. And when you factor in that the Texans are absolutely atrocious versus the rush, then I think this is going to be a big, Nyheim Hines, Jonathan Taylor game potentially. So it's going to limit those wide receivers even more so. That's why Hilton and Zach Pascal I have listed as sits. Then for the Texans, it gets really interesting here because no more Will Fuller suspended due to that PED situation. So Brandon Cooks, he is fully the wide receiver 1 for the Houston Texans. I bet right now they really wish that they hadn't let go of Kenny Stills, Randall Cobb nicked up. So Brandon Cooks, I'm not sure whether he's going to immediately reproduce those numbers that Will Fuller was. It's going to depend a lot on how much volume he gets, but he definitely goes up in our rankings, high-end wide receiver 2. And then if you guys are looking for that dart throw, because there will be enough volume offensively, passing yards to sustain a second wide receiver. Right now, our pick would be Kiki Kuti just because of the nature of the wide receiver room. We'll see if any wide receivers are picked up, during this week. That could potentially change that situation. So keep an eye out for that. But right now, Brandon Cooks the surest thing in this matchup. Moving on, we've got the Browns at the Titans. We're starting Jarvis Landry, and look, he finally had that huge, and I mean huge, blow-up game last week. We told you, don't give up on him yet. It'll turn around. He's by far the best wide receiver there and most reliable target for Baker Mayfield, and he could be in line for another big game versus this Titans secondary. I think he is a solid mid-level wide receiver 2 and maybe even higher in PPR scoring. While for the Titans, A.J. Brown, he is still the most consistent wide receiver on the offense, the highest touchdown upside. Yes, maybe you can consider Corey Davis, who we currently have as a sit, but that's more so if Adam Humphries returns, because then, the separation between Corey Davis, Adam Humphries, not as much as you would think. So I think that's going to take away from the targets there, the opportunities, while A.J. Brown is still that, top option wide receiver wise for the Tennessee offense. And then also Rashard Higgins, a sit on the Browns side of things. I anticipate a lot of Landry and then a lot of the running backs here from both sides. So really only 2 wide receiver names to know, the big guys, Landry and A.J. Brown. Next up, we've got the Lions at the Bears. And here for the Lions, if Kenny Golladay plays, and that's a big if, you start him. If he doesn't, then it's Marvin Jones again, and you know that Jones will get a lot of volume. If Kenny Golladay plays, then I would probably be, I would still start Marvin Jones as a low-end wide receiver 2, primarily in standard formats, also because I expect Kenny Golladay to be limited, but he has enough touchdown upside on his own to also warrant a start. So both these guys probably low-end wide receiver 2s in standard scoring. If Golladay doesn't play, then Marvin Jones mid-level wide receiver 2, because it is still a tough matchup. But the wide receiver that we love here is Allen Robinson versus this atrocious Lions defense. The Bears always get up versus the Lions. They have good outings versus them, regardless of who the quarterback will be here. I expect a good performance from Robinson in the low-end wide receiver 1 category. But still, let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're only projecting one fantasy relevant wide receiver for the Bears like it's been all year long. So Mooney and Miller are sits. Jaguars at the Vikings next. Here, if DJ Shark plays, then you should start him versus this really bad Vikings secondary. And because it's so bad that it might actually warrant a second Jaguars wide receiver start. If you guys are looking for that dart throw, it would be Keelan Cole in our eyes. And the way it would work here, if DJ Chark doesn't play, then we elevate Keelan Cole a little bit more so. And then Colin Johnson goes up in our rankings from a sit to a start, who had a nice big game this last week. But if Chark plays, then I wouldn't go chasing the points, and Johnson and Laviska would both be sits. Then for the Vikings here, this is really where you should be focusing on Adam Thielen, Justin Jefferson. Both great plays versus this Jaguars defense. Low-end wide receiver ones, both very solid plays on the week. Saints at the Falcons next. And here, Michael Thomas is the name you should be looking at because he's getting the volume right now. And yes, I realize that the last time these two teams played, that Taysom Hill had success through the air. But now that we've got a bigger sample size, it's easy to see he's not that passing type of quarterback. Yes, the Falcons defense is friendly, but I'm not taking a chance on a second wide receiver here, aka Emmanuel Sanders, on this offense. So I'm only looking at Michael Thomas, probably high-end wide receiver 2, low-end wide receiver 1. Then for the Falcons, Calvin Ridley and Julio Jones. Assuming that both of these guys play, they are probably in a similar situation because of the tough Saints defense. I anticipate you're going to see a lot of pressure after Matt Ryan again. So that reason leads us to say Ridley and Jones, high-end wide receiver 2s, but still the preferred options over Michael Thomas, as at least they have a quarterback that can reliably get them the football. Afterwards, Rams at the Cardinals. We'll start Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods. They continue to be rock-solid wide receiver 2 plays, especially in PPR scoring. Simple as that. Then for the Cardinals, yes, it's a tough matchup, but DeAndre Hopkins is your best bet here. This is a tough defense, but I anticipate that the Cardinals will show up and have a better performance than they did versus the New England Patriots. That's kind of the first bad quote-unquote game that Kyler Murray has had this season, but I wouldn't get too carried away. That's why the other wide receivers here, primarily Christian Kirk, who's already kind of boom or bust to begin with, is someone that I would fade. Afterwards, Giants at the Seahawks, and this has a huge asterisk next to it because of the status of Daniel Jones. If Daniel Jones does not play, the only wide receiver that I would take a chance on is Sterling Shepard. But if he does play, I don't mind taking a chance on Darius Slayton as well, kind of that home run hitter, especially versus the Seahawks secondary. But either way, that duo cannot compare to DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, both the better options. Metcalf is the preferred choice because he is more consistent and has a higher floor compared to Tyler Lockett, who we have seen, even though he can have huge games, he can also disappear from time to time as well. Then for the Giants, odd man out, Golden Tate. If Daniel Jones, again, does not play, I would say even more so he becomes a sit. Next up, we've got the Patriots at the Chargers, and when looking at the Patriots wide receivers, Jacoby Myers is the preferred choice in our opinion. Now, to be fair, this Patriots offense is lackluster, especially in the passing department, and even more so when you compound the struggles of Cam Newton. That's why we'd only really start one of these guys. Myers is our preferred choice. Yes, Bird had a solid game this last week, but we think Myers is the better overall wide receiver, and at this point in time, we would not risk starting two New England Patriots as far as fantasy is concerned. Now, for the Chargers, Keenan Allen, he is the no-brainer choice, and even though it's a tough matchup, the volume is absolutely insane. He's still a low-end wide receiver 1 at worst. Looking at our sits, we went over Demir Bird, probably not a good choice to start. But for the Chargers, Mike Williams may be a bit of a surprise, but with the return of Austin Eckler, we saw last week how heavily involved he was in the passing attack. That'll probably mean less and less involvement for these other wide receivers not named Keenan Allen. So for that reason, Mike Williams is a sit. Next up, Eagles at the Packers. The only wide receiver I would remotely consider here for the Eagles is Jalen Reagor, and that might even be pushing it, especially if he matches up with Jair Alexander. So that's something to keep an eye out for. The other guys, Travis Fulgham, Alshon Jeffrey, a couple other names, maybe even a Greg Ward. Simply put, since the return of Dallas Goedert and Jalen Reagor, these guys have become afterthoughts. And especially in a game here versus the Packers, where the Eagles will probably focus on the run with capable guys in Miles Sanders and Boston Scott, And why wouldn't you, considering how bad the Packers have been defending the run? Fulgham and Jeffrey become even bigger passes for us. And for Green Bay, Devontae Adams, obviously you start him every single week. And then Lazard is someone that you could potentially take a chance on. Since his return, MVS has kind of become that odd man out. That's why he is a sit. But Lazard, again, could benefit here, a bit boom or bust. But with the Eagles' tough rush defense, maybe this is a game where Aaron Rodgers really airs it out and Lazard could benefit in addition to Devontae Adams. Afterwards, Broncos at the Chiefs. The only wide receiver you really want to start here is Tyreek Hill, and honestly, for both those sides, for the Chiefs, we know what the situation is. Hill is the most consistent wide receiver on this offense. He's been relatively consistent as well, coming off a huge week, and that's the type of upside that he has. Absolutely electric, a locked and loaded wide receiver one every single week. Mecole Hardman a little bit too inconsistent. I believe that Travis Kelce would get it going again here, along with guys like Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So passing on Hardman, but you see every single Broncos wide receiver here, Jeudy and Tim Patrick. You can throw KJ Hamler in there as well as sits, and this will be very dependent on which quarterback lines up for the Broncos. This last week, they had to rely on a practice squad wide receiver, and that was disastrous. So if it's a situation somewhat similar to that, then Jeudy and Patrick become sits again. If not, I'd start Jerry Jeudy, and I'd probably also take a chance on Tim Patrick. Jeudy is the higher upside guy. Tim Patrick, a high-end wide receiver 3 on the week, while Jeudy, a low-end wide receiver 2. Afterwards, Washington at the Steelers. For Washington, Terry McLaurin is pretty much a surefire start every single week. Normally a low-end wide receiver 1, I would say probably a mid to high-end wide receiver 2 here, considering the tough Pittsburgh Steelers defense. And for Pittsburgh, this is tough considering the fact that they still haven't played yet. Usually by this point in time, we at least know what these teams have showed us the week prior, but that's not the case with the Steelers. So we're going to go with the safe bets in Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool. Deontay Johnson has become the surefire wide receiver 1 for this team at this point in time. Tentatively, we have Juju Smith-Schuster as a sit. That's because he was nicked up, heading into this prior game for the Pittsburgh Steelers. If he looks okay and if he doesn't have any setbacks, he could work his way into a start, but Deontay Johnson, the preferred option here. Afterwards, Bills at the 49ers. Stephon Diggs, Cole Beasley, they're the starts that you want. If John Brown returns, I would put him in that Cole Beasley slot. And also still keep Beasley as a start, especially in those PPR formats. For the 49ers, Deebo Samuel and Brendan Ayuk, who is expected to return from that COVID designation. And sure, Samuel had a huge week this last matchup, but keep in mind that was without Brendan Ayuk, so expect some smaller numbers, but either way, both these guys probably startable low-end wide receiver 2s. Then for the Bills, Gabriel Davis, I would put him in a sit, especially if John Brown returns. And then Kendrick Bourne, even though he did have a decent performance in terms of targets this last week, with Ayuk expected to return, we would sit him. And finally, Cowboys at the Ravens. The only wide receiver you really want to remotely start here is Amari Cooper, and honestly, that's it, because for the Ravens, what the hell is going to happen with their COVID situation? Is Lamar Jackson going to be back? We still don't know what Robert Griffin will look like in this offense with guys like Marquise Brown and Willie Snead, what the connection will be. So unless Lamar Jackson returns, I'm sitting every single pretty much wide receiver for the Ravens. And then Michael Gallup and CeeDee Lamb. Unfortunately, we've said this week in and week out, but after the Dak injury, there's pretty much only one relevant fantasy wide receiver. Right now, it's looking to be Amari Cooper. So for that reason, Gallup and Lamb are sits. So with that, we wrap up our Week 13 fantasy wide receiver starts and sits. And as always, let us hear it in the comment section. Do you agree, disagree, along with any other start or sit questions you guys might have? We'll make sure to answer them. And in the meantime, if you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe, and give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to continue interacting with us as the week progresses. Send us your questions there as well. We answer all of those. And finally, check us out online at alldaypigskin.com. Sign up for a free newsletter to get access to exclusive content. All those details in the description. But for now, we'll see you guys in future videos.